At the spring market, her former fiancé sneered, "Didn't expect you to last." Before she could speak, a silent woodsman stepped from the crowd, placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "She's more woman than you could ever deserve." The entire square froze, but what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Clara Hastings had never been the sort of woman others waited for. She was the one who held coats at barn dances, the one who baked for church suppers but was seldom invited to sit beside anyone. At 41, she wore her solitude like an old shawl, frayed, familiar, quietly suffocating. The letter from Harold Green had pierced that fabric like sunlight through shutters. A stranger from Montana, writing in a hand both confident and restrained, had called her strong. Not pleasant or well-meaning, but strong. That word alone made her sit taller the moment she read it. It echoed in her mind for weeks afterward, louder than the creak of her empty home, louder than the gossip that trickled through the town like cold syrup. In the weeks that followed, Clara moved with a deliberate urgency. She folded away the linens she'd embroidered as a girl, kissed the top rail of the wooden porch her father had built, and wrapped her mother's quilt, the one stitched with purple wildflowers, in brown paper for the journey. She did not cry, not then. Her tears had been spent years ago, dried up by funerals, quiet birthdays, and the sharp glances of strangers who measured her by waistline before word. The journey west was long and cold. She sat by the train window and watched the flat farmlands shift into rolling hills, and then into the stark, snow-shouldered silhouettes of the Montana wilderness. The landscape felt clean. Brutal, yes, but clean. Every frozen tree and distant peak whispered a kind of honesty she had never known in towns full of grins too tight and compliments too cruel. She stepped off the train in Bitter Pine just as twilight began to pull its shawl over the valley. Harold stood near the platform, a man carved from the same hard lines as the land, weathered, straight-backed, and silent. Clara recognized him at once, not from any photograph, but from the rhythm of his name and the gravity she imagined when she read his words. But there was no recognition in his face, only calculation. His gaze flicked over her like a carpenter inspecting warped wood. And then came the words, thin, precise, and irreversible. "You're not what I expected." Something in Clara's chest folded inward, but she did not break. Not there. Not then. She turned from him as if he were the wind itself, something to brace against but not be undone by, and walked into the unknown with the quiet defiance of a woman who still dared to believe in her own worth, even as the snow swallowed her footprints behind her. The room above the apothecary was no more than 12 feet across, its slanted ceiling making even that feel smaller. The wallpaper had faded into a sleepy yellow, and the floor creaked like an old violin with every step. But it was warm, and it was hers. Clara lit the stove with fingers that no longer shook and set about restoring the only thing she had left, her dignity. Each morning she drew the lace curtain aside and watched the townspeople scuttle through the frost-bitten streets of Bitter Pine. They rarely looked up, but she felt their eyes just the same. Women whispered behind baskets of laundry. Men cast glances they thought subtle as they hitched their horses. She became a local myth faster than she'd unpacked her thimble. "That's her," they'd murmur at the general store. "The one who came for a man and left with nothing." But Clara hadn't left with nothing. She'd left with her name intact. And that, she decided, was a kind of fortune. She stitched her way into the fabric of the town quietly. With a borrowed sewing machine and a basket of scraps, she began to mend what others discarded. Frayed collars, missing buttons, the ragged hopes of women too busy to sit and sew. Her fingers moved with purpose, each stitch a whispered promise to herself that she would not disappear. The apothecary's wife, Mrs. Lattimore, gave her space without pity. In the evenings, Clara baked. Slow, methodical work that filled the narrow hallway with the scent of nutmeg and flour. She'd rise before dawn to walk into the woods and gather chokeberries and wild apples, her breath clouding the air as she moved through snow-packed silence. The pies she made were deep and dark, not pretty, but honest, and the people bought them. Still, they watched, some out of judgment, others out of something softer, though no one dared offer it aloud. One gray afternoon, on her way to the schoolhouse with a still warm pie and a worn copy of Jane Eyre tucked beneath her shawl, the book slipped from her arms and tumbled into the slush. Before she could bend to retrieve it, a large gloved hand reached down. "I read that once," the man said, voice like weathered pine. "Changed me." She looked up and met the gaze of Elijah Porter. There was no smirk, no leer, just a quiet steadiness that unsettled her more than any cruelty ever had. And in that instant, Clara understood. Kindness could be just as disarming as scorn. The thaw came not all at once, but in whispers. Icicles shrinking drop by drop from the eaves of the chapel, frost receding from window panes like a sigh released. Mud replaced snow in the narrow lanes of bitter pine, and the scent of wet earth began to rise again after months of silence. Clara noticed it first when her fingers, long chilled by stubborn drafts, could move freely over her needlework without stiffening. The quilt she'd begun in the hush of midwinter had grown into something more than layers of cotton and thread. It had become a journal without ink, a memory stitched into wings and sky. She worked at night, after pies had cooled and garments had been folded into parcels. By the dim glow of a single oil lamp, she stitched pieces of old dresses, scraps from customers' hems, and even a square of blue from her mother's apron. Each triangle, each feathered curve of cloth, marked a small reclamation of something once lost: dignity, hope, self-regard. The birds sewn into the design did not mimic any species found in Montana skies. They were imagined, free and weightless. What Clara could not speak aloud, she sewed. Elijah had become a constant in his quiet way. He appeared without pattern, sometimes to bring her beeswax candles, other times a book he thought she might like. He said little, but his silences were never hollow. They held attention, interest, even warmth. He never once asked about Harold. He never once spoke about her shape, her past, or the stories whispered in town. When he looked at her, it wasn't through her. He looked into her, as though her thoughts were more visible to him than her figure ever had been to others. At the spring market, Clara laid her wares on a table dressed in plain linen, quilts folded in neat stacks beside glass jars of rhubarb jam and braided lavender sachets. She wore a gray dress with a brooch made from a button Elijah had carved. The townspeople no longer looked through her. They looked at her, and they smiled, not out of charity, but something closer to respect. Then Harold passed by. He paused, sneered. "Didn't expect you to last," he muttered. She did not reply. She didn't need to. Elijah stepped forward, calm and steady, his hand brushing her shoulder with the ease of familiarity. "She's more woman than you could ever deserve," he said. Not loudly, but with a finality that silenced the air. Clara reached for the quilt she had folded beneath the table, stitched with flight, patience, and resilience. "This one's for you," she said. Elijah took it as though it were something sacred. "You're perfect," he whispered, and this time she believed it. The town of Bitter Pine had not seen a festival in 7 years, not since the floods, not since the war, not since joy had become something spoken of only in past tense. But that May, with wildflowers blooming defiantly through cracks in the boardwalk and bees humming against newly whitewashed fences, something shifted. The townspeople, hardened by winters, softened by time, hung lanterns from pine branches and swept the square clean of ash and silence. Clara stood by the edge of the clearing, watching children chase fireflies between the trees. The shawl wrapped around her shoulders was sky blue, hand-woven, its edges soft with use and affection. In one corner, nearly hidden in the stitching, was a pine cone, small, deliberate, a detail no one else would notice, but she did. It was Elijah's quiet way of saying, "I see you." Fiddle music spun through the air, simple and sweet. Couples circled the square, boots brushing dirt into rhythm. When Elijah approached, he said nothing, just extended a hand as naturally as offering bread. Clara looked at it for a moment, then slipped hers into his. His palm was calloused, his grip steady. There was no performance in his gesture, no drama, just truth. They danced slowly, not for the crowd, but for themselves. Her head came to rest near his chest, and she could hear the steady thrum of his heart, unhurried, sure. Around them, life continued. Laughter, footsteps, the creak of lantern cords swaying in the breeze. But to Clara, the world felt still, as if time had folded inward to grant her this one unguarded moment. At the edge of the square, Harold stood with his arms crossed, watching, his face unreadable, his mouth a tight line. Clara didn't glance his way, not because she feared what she might see, but because she no longer needed to look. The weight of his opinion no longer lived on her shoulders. What the townsfolk witnessed that evening was not a rescue, nor a courtship in bloom. It was a quiet coronation. A woman once dismissed now moved through the evening like a flame, soft, warm, undeniable. Not made radiant by a man's attention, but reflected by it. Made visible because someone chose to recognize what had always been there. When the music waned, Elijah reached up and gently tucked a loose curl behind her ear. "You didn't change," he said. "You just stopped hiding." Clara's lips curved, her voice calm. "You didn't rescue me, Elijah. You reminded me that I never needed to be rescued." No kiss followed, no applause. Just the rustle of trees and the hush of something whole settling into place. And afterward, when little girls asked their mothers who the woman in blue had been, they answered, "She's the one who showed us that grace comes not from how the world sees you, but from how you choose to stand in it."